Descent proved to be a positive success when it first came out in 1994, a game that would define 3D shooters utilizing 6 degrees of freedom. Looking back at Doom, it pioneered the genre enough to spawn a sequel, Doom 2. Unlike the previous game, however, Doom 2 laid a foundation for endless amounts of user content. That would be thanks to the additional content added on top of what already existed, bringing in new enemies, a double-barreled shotgun, linear progression, super shotgun spam, and raising your phone bill for constantly playing deathmatches over on a modem. It was basically what John Romero described as a bigger, badder, and better version of Doom. Of course, Descent grew popular enough to churn out a sequel that they delivered a year after the first game was released commercially. That would be in the form of Descent 2, released in March 13th, 1996 for the MS-DOS platform. Normally, Descent 2 could have been described as a sequel similar to Doom 2 since it was built on top of the previous game with expanded content. However, this almost wasn't the case. Looking back to the retail release of Descent, and inside the high score menu, you could pretty much see that Parallax was teasing a CD-enhanced version of the game. This planned release brought up features that would otherwise be carried over to Descent 2 and ports to various platforms. Redbook CD music and Super VGA resolutions would be carried over to the Apple Macintosh port, while 3D rendered cutscenes would be carried over to the Sony PlayStation port. Also, the enhanced version of Descent, according to a README document, suggests that new levels, power-ups, enemies, higher quality sound effects, and new multiplayer-specific features were to be introduced. However, despite the plans to get it out by the late summer of 1995, the project never saw the light of day. Instead, it turned into a standalone sequel, which became clear when people got a sneak preview of what Descent 2 had to offer on October 30th, 1995. And on top of that, a 3-level interactive demo of Descent 2 was released almost 2 months later. Now, remembering what I said about the comparison between Doom and Doom 2, I will say that comparing Descent 2 to Descent varies. Let's start by looking at the plot as it picks up right where the first game ended. Previously, you got the basic gist of the story. A hired mercenary known as the Material Defender was tasked to blow up PTMC mines in the solar system that were compromised by a computer virus, turning the robots into killing machines. Well, after you've done just that by defeating the final boss, you soon find out from Samuel Dravis that you were unable to return, citing fears that the Pyro GX ship you piloted was also compromised with the virus. In actuality, however, it was an exploited loophole in order to coerce the Material Defender into accepting yet another mission. This time, it involves the PTMC's deep space mines located beyond the solar system. The ship was equipped with a prototype warp core just for this task. Now, what is retained from the previous game would be the arsenal of weapons, combined with the new additional weapons that you would be using. However, the returning weapons would suffer some nerfing in order to give the new weapons a bigger spotlight. The level 4 quad lasers would be made obsolete by level 6 super lasers that deal more damage, but at the cost of slowing down your firing rate just a tad bit. One of the more satisfying upgrades would be upgrading from the Vulcan cannon to a Gauss cannon. To many Descent 2 players, including myself, this would be one of the most used weapons in the game next to the super lasers due to its firepower. The overall design and sound effects that this weapon makes is a worthwhile upgrade that almost makes the Vulcan cannon completely useless, somewhat. Keep in mind that the Gauss cannon is not recommended up close due to the splash damage, but I do believe that the Vulcan cannon is still king against lava thanks to its faster firing rate. While the spread-fire cannon has its uses despite the high energy consumption, the Helix cannon proves to be more destructive with 5 projectiles spiraling in 8 directions as opposed to 3 projectiles spewing in a horizontal to vertical pattern. It's useful against swarms of enemies, bosses, and reactors, but it comes at the cost of draining your energy much quicker. The plasma cannon, like the previous game, is up there with the quad lasers, except you have a faster firing rate at the cost of energy. But upgrading to the Phoenix cannon proves to be pretty decent at most. The positives are higher damage and bouncing projectiles. The negatives is the bouncing projectiles backfiring on you. Lastly, the fusion cannon's usefulness was nerfed in favor of the Omega cannon. To me, I feel like the Omega Cannon is something I barely use, even in multiplayer. Despite being devastating to use, its usefulness is overpowered by its very limited range and time having to be spent recharging. But keep in mind that in the original versions of Descent, unpatched, the fusion cannon was dog water. It's only when the patches started to roll out that the fusion cannon became a beloved staple even in multiplayer. However, it's not to say that it's completely useless, since the larger projectiles proves to be somewhat useful against annoying popcorn-sized enemies. Well, to be fair, my playthrough had me using the super lasers and Gauss cannon more than anything else. When we start heading to the missile weapons, they do behave just about the same, except you gain access to flash missiles that stun enemies, and guided missiles that prove very useful for picking off more tougher enemies in tricky situations. The proximity mines in the first Descent weren't as useful, but the smart mines, however, are very useful due to the homing projectiles spewed out after exploding. I believe that the Mercury missiles are the biggest highlight from the rest of the additional missiles, mainly due to its high damage and fast projectile speed. Then lastly, the Earthshaker missiles are even more deadlier and are true to its name, but they can be hard to find and best saved for the final level. That we will get to in a bit. Unlike the first game, Descent 2 also introduced about 3 things that made it a bit more accessible to newcomers. The first being the afterburners that allow the Pyro GX to boost movement at the expense of energy. It was originally to be implemented into the first game, but it went unused. The source code indicates that it was fully implemented, but it was commented out before the game released. Second was the Guide Bot. It's an ally robot that was more of a response to an issue where players at times got a bit lost trying to find essential parts of a level, like the reactor and the exit door. Alternatively, you could spawn markers that can be seen in the auto map. At least to me, this can be a bit of a godsend because not only this prevents one-time use doors from closing in and becoming inaccessible later, it also keeps note on the location of the exit door. With that being said, the Guide Bot isn't 100% needed anyway, at least to me, but it can also help you find keycards and energy centers as well. The game also provided additional power-ups like the energy to shield converter and the headlights for darker areas. In certain parts of my playthrough, I've maxed out my shields with the converter thanks to my heavy usage of the Gauss cannon while collecting energy pickups. Lastly, you have a power-up that reveals the full map since the previous game lacked one, so have fun with that. Now, the next thing I want to bring up, because this is a Descent video after all, would be the difficulty. Descent is notorious for its somewhat unforgivable enemy roster, with Super Hulks and Class 1 drillers being brought up very often. Then you got Descent 2, which would introduce a new roster of enemies that are a bit more forgiving but still annoying. Although the original roster remains unused, but players can add them into their custom levels. As a matter of fact, Parallax would re-release the game as the Infinite Abyss, to which included support for Windows 95 and 3D accelerators, but they also included an add-on known as the Vertigo series. This add-on featured levels that combined both enemy rosters, but I do plan on making a video about it in the near future. There are some enemies that bear similar behaviors to those of the original roster, like the Diamond Claw that behaves like a lifter but spews out homing projectiles in response to energy-based weapons, which in that case makes weapons like the Gauss Cannon a viable choice against them. However, despite the absence of Class 1 drillers and Super Hulks, it doesn't automatically make Descent 2 an easier game in comparison. In fact, the low guards you face later on are roughly the same in behavior, except their attacks deal less damage than their predecessor. At the same time, you're also dealing with enemies with more aggressive AI logic and are capable of more dangerous attacks, with the most dangerous out of the rest being the Boar Shed that appears to be the only enemy to have an extreme threat rating due to the utilization of smart missiles. If dealing with more aggressive enemies wasn't bad enough, this would be combined with the typical annoying swarms like Sidearm Modulas, Red Hornets, and even Omega defense spawns that jump you like kamikazes. And if that's not enough to ruin your day, just like how every level has a guide bot, every level now has the polar opposite of helpful. That would be in the form of bandits, also known as thief bots. They are annoying enough to become top priority in hunting down as they get in the way of level progression by stealing some of your collected items. And to further prove that Descent 2 is not easier than the previous game, the The boss fights in Descent 2 are proven to be more difficult than the two bosses you would have fought in the previous game. And I honestly don't blame anybody for quitting their playthrough of Descent 2 or let alone cheating this, because here's why. The final boss is the icing on the cake because it only takes missiles and hit scan weapons towards the back, and that is the only way. This makes saving both Mega Missiles and Earthshaker missiles a top priority to save up. You also have to make them count, otherwise you might as well just start over. It's that brutal. And you also have to make sure that you use your invulnerability and cloak devices wisely on top of that. Taking the difficulty of Descent 2 aside, there is some additional changes to the level design, like shootable switches, force fields, and the fact you have secret levels that are often treated as bonus levels with plenty of loot to collect. And you can access it again as long as you don't blow up the reactor. There was one interesting secret level where it was more of a time rush to collect items since the reactor needed to be blown up for everything to unlock. In that level, however, multiple reactors were even placed to expand timing as well. Descent 2 came out around the time when CD Red Book audio was fresh, but sadly suffers from having a lackluster amount of MIDI music. But it's not to say that either one of them or even both of them were bad soundtracks or anything. As a matter of fact, the Red Book soundtrack is interesting because it carries a high energy vibe, fusing techno with some industrial rock. The soundtrack was also notable for having an instrumental remix of a track called Haunted, which was composed by Typo Negative. Then there was two tracks, Glut and Rat Says, that were composed by Mark Walk and Nivek Ogre. Both were also part of a electro-industrial band called Skinny Puppy. However, the MIDI soundtrack composed by Dan Wentz is also a recommended listen because it is well crafted and serves its level progression pattern pretty well. Each time the level 4 track is played, you are definitely guaranteed a boss fight, and you are expecting to hear this track about 6 times since the game has 24 standard levels. All of them are divided into 7 themes, with certain boss fights having weak points that plays a part of its difficulty. The overall level design itself, unlike its predecessor, has been more open and expanded, but it came at the cost of it being more demanding for lower end hardware. Speaking of that, due to the fact that it was built on top of the same engine of the previous game, you're still bound to the fact that it's pretty sensitive to higher end hardware. Most of the footage you're seeing right now is coming from a source port named Chocolate Descent, which has a frame limiter allowing me to cap it at 45 frames per second. To me, this serves as a proper middle ground to having smooth gameplay while also having comfortable mouse control. Which is weird to me because I was playing on much faster hardware that is a couple of decades newer. You probably would have expected me to play this at 144 frames per second, but no. But then you probably watched my previous videos and expected me to play this on a 486 at 15 frames per second or lower. But, for a rather unforgivable game at most, I probably would like to keep my muscle memory intact. With authentic hardware, you had to put up with slower specs or on more demanding resolutions like 640 by 480 just for comfortable mouse control in what was a more joystick-dominant 3D shooter. While the sequel proved to be more popular, it soon made its way to game consoles like the Sony PlayStation as Descent Maximum, with a more toned-down version of the single-player campaign. Descent 2 would also bring support for various 3D accelerator cards like the 3DFX Voodoo, Rendition Verite, and the infamous S3 Verge. I can't say about the Verite, but I have tried out the others. 3DFX offers a performance boost reaching at 60 frames per second, well, nearly, on a 233MHz Pentium MMX, but can be a bit unstable and lacks support for the cockpit view. Then again, you're not missing much with the S3D version as you barely get a performance gain, at least based on my benchmark comparison on a 486DX4 clocked at 100MHz. The multiplayer for Descent 2 offers more features like disallowing certain weapons, an actual frame and time limit, along with extra game modes like Capture the Flag and Horde. Around the time, both Descent games remained popular on multiplayer services like Kali and Khan. One thing to bring up, however, is that the playstyle for both games differ in comparison. On one hand, players preferred Descent 2 because of the netcode optimizations, extra features, super VGA resolutions, and a fast-paced playstyle thanks to the heavy use of afterburners. Then on the other hand, players stuck to the first game due to the perception that Descent 2's weapon balance did not translate well in PvP sessions, making it a lesser skilled game. It's an interesting topic because top-tier weapons like the fusion cannon were heavily favored in Descent's multiplayer, and certain players felt the nerfing was an unnecessary decision, rightfully so. So in that case, weapons like the lasers, Gauss cannon, and even the plasma cannon were the most common. Nowadays, the original multiplayer can be experienced using network guiders like Classic Gaming Arena. For source ports, I do recommend D2X Redux, as that's where most of the multiplayer activity is at. That aside, Descent 2 offered better handling of user content like maps with custom textures and 3D objects, whereas the original game required third-party patching tools like DTX to get working properly. However, you could theoretically play the original Descent levels when they are converted using programs like Descent Mission Builder 2. Even though you'll still encounter the original enemies again, you will be missing the original textures and you are subjected to weapon imbalance as well. Unlike the first game, Descent 2 did not get its own levels of the world. Instead, we did receive an expansion in the form of the Vertigo series. That add-on I'd plan to cover in the future. Descent 2 was considered to be the last game under the Parallax software name, largely due to the two founders working in two distinct offices located between Illinois and Michigan. Ultimately, Parallax was split into two in November 1996 with the founding of Volition and Outrage Entertainment. The former would later go on to release games like Descent Free Space, Red Faction, and Saints Row, while Outrage Entertainment would go on to develop Descent 3, a game I plan to cover in the near future. Lastly, what are my overall thoughts on Descent 2? Well, if you like the first game, I do believe it's worth giving it a shot, especially if you're craving more Descent. It's still a difficult game to complete, but I can see why some would prefer it over the first Descent. Despite the gameplay balance changes, it managed to address some of the issues that newcomers may encounter with the first game. If DOSBox isn't really your thing, I also recommend checking out source ports like D2X Redux and Chocolate Descent, which will be in the description down below. Anyway, that'll be it for this video. I hope you find this enjoyable. If you got any thoughts on the game, then please leave me a comment. I would like to give out thanks to my tiny amount of patrons with vocal shoutouts to Kuji and 8bits apart. If you'd like to see this list grow and help support the channel, the link will be in the description down below. Thank you for your support, and as always, thank you all for watching and peace out. See ya.